We're only about 10 days away from Christmas, so well into the Advent season. And Advent is all about getting ready, getting prepared for the coming of Christ. Now, all of us in this room, I presume, believe that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah. And the Messiah came roughly just over 2,000 years ago. But I would challenge each and every one of us and say, you probably believe that axiomatically. What do I mean by that? You believe it really without question. You took it on faith. This is what you were taught, firstly by your parents, then by teachers at school, religious brothers, nuns, or lay people. Or that's what you heard at church when you were taken to church by your parents, and that's what you hear when you go to church each Advent, etc. But we have to remember that when Jesus of Nazareth came into the world, he had to prove his case, and his followers had to prove the case that Jesus of Nazareth was the fulfillment of the prophetic expectations embedded in the Old Testament. So the first followers of Jesus were, of course, Jews, and Jesus, of course, was a Jew himself, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So what the early Christians, the early followers of Jesus had to do was to highlight those prophecies, those expectations that were in Old Testament scripture, in the Jewish scriptures, and show that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled those expectations. Now, this is one very important reason why the Old Testament is still a book of high importance, great importance, absolute importance for Christians. The early heresies in the 2nd and 3rd century, Christians so-called, who put it out there that the Old Testament was not for Christians, it was only for Jews. It was a book of another God even, the God of anger, the God of judgment, the God of condemnation. The God of Jesus was not that same God. But this was a heretical stream, and the early Christian Orthodox apologists, etc., combated that heresy. So what my general purpose tonight is to look at how Christians, early Christians, and I mean the apostles, the evangelists, the writers of New Testament epistles, what prophecies they saw in the Old Testament that they claimed were fulfilled by Jesus of Nazareth, and embedded those prophecies in the New Testament writings. I'm not going to go into too much more detail than that because this is too big a topic. I'm not going to look at the counter arguments that are put forward, particularly by Jewish apologists, as to why these same prophecies we're looking at tonight should not be interpreted in the way that Christians interpret them. But I've listed the prophecies not in the chronological order in which they were made or appear in the Old Testament, but according to the chronology of Christ's life. So, being Advent now, I'm going to start with the first prophecies that predicted that there would be a Messiah, that Messiah would be born of a virgin, that Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, etc. But then I'll continue right through his life, and even prophecies concerning the church that Jesus founded. So we'll start virtually at the beginning, or close enough to it. We'll go to the book of Genesis, and we'll go to a very familiar verse for us, which is Genesis 3:15. And this is a record of Yahweh's pronouncement against Lucifer. After Lucifer had succeeded, had triumphed over our original parents, Adam and Eve, and brought them under his dominion. But God nevertheless gives this condemnation, this pronouncement against Lucifer. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, to get straight to the point here, not to divert to a completely another topic, this enmity that God will put between the devil and the woman is the Immaculate Conception. Lucifer has won dominion over the first Eve, but won't have dominion over the new Eve or the second Eve. That woman is Mary, the Virgin Mary. Your seed, that is the devil's seed, are the followers of the devil. And the seed of the woman, of course, is Mary's child who will be that Messiah, and the followers of that Messiah. He shall bruise your head. Stronger translations have it, he shall crush your head. That means that the devil, you will be humbled. You will be defeated by this child of this woman. And you shall bruise his heel, meaning the devil will inflict some pain or injury on this Messiah who will crush the devil. And we see that in the picture of the crucifixion. What looks to be apparent defeat of the Messiah, that is his bruising, his heel being bruised, is actually the crushing defeat for Lucifer, his head being crushed. Now, there's been controversy over the centuries as to whether this should be she shall crush or he shall crush. I don't see any point in that debate because it's all about cooperation between Jesus and Mary in any case. As there was a cooperation in the downfall of humanity, the devil, Eve, Adam, there was a cooperation in the recovery of humanity. The angel Gabriel, Mary, Jesus. And this defeat of the devil could not have happened without Mary's yes being part of this picture, etc. The next prophecy is Genesis 12:13. And Genesis 12 marks the beginning of what we call patriarchal history, as distinct from primeval history. The first 11 chapters of Genesis record the beginnings of the universe, the beginning of the world, and the first history of Adam and Eve, the fall, the covenant with Noah, the flood, etc., etc. Now we come to Abraham, or dealing with the 21st century BC, and his calling. And we have here, in Genesis 12:3, the main chapters relating to Abraham are from Genesis 12 through to 15, 17, 22. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse. And by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. Now this was recognized by St. Luke in Acts 3 verses 25 to 26 as relating to Jesus. And St. Peter himself, it's St. Peter himself who's preaching just outside the temple, at the beautiful gate of the temple precinct, preaching that Jesus of Nazareth is a fulfillment of this particular prophecy. How? The main promises made by Yahweh to Abraham were 4 to 5. One, that you will have a great name, or a great Shem, that means name. So Abraham, that's his second name. His original name was Abram. Abram means exalted father. He'll have a great name, and that would be Abraham, father of many peoples, of many nations. I will give to you and your descendants land. That land will be Canaan. And under Moses and Joshua, the descendants of Abraham through Isaac would secure that land of Canaan. Name, descendants that number as the stars. Now Abraham is the father generally of the Hebrew peoples through Isaac, and also through the Arab peoples and many other peoples through his second wife, Hagar the Egyptian, who had Ishmael, and then Abraham's third wife, Keturah. Abraham had 6 sons through Keturah, one of them being Midian. So that was the third promise, that he would have descendants that would number as the stars. And kings, this is the fourth promise, kings would come from his descendants. The kings here came through the house of David. So Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac begot Jacob and Esau. We're going through the line of Jacob. And Jacob had 4 wives and 12 sons. And through his first wife, Leah, the 4th son through Leah was Judah. And hence the Jews come from Judah. But David, the house of David, were of that tribe. And the house of David was the house of kings. And then there'll be one of those, a descendant of David, from that kingly line, who would be the one through which the families of the earth will bless themselves. It is Jesus of Nazareth, a Jew from the house of David, who would be the fulfillment of this particular prophecy. And that was the endeavour of St. Peter when preaching at the beautiful gate, as recorded in Acts 3, verses 25 to 26. The next prophecy is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, 18:15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren. Listen to him. Now this is Moses speaking at the latter end of his prophetic mission. I'm passing from this world, but one day Yahweh will send another prophet like me. It's the same St. Peter preaching the same sermon at the beautiful gate, who also declares that this particular prophecy is fulfilled by Jesus of Nazareth. But where do we see it fulfilled? Where is the evidence? Is there specific evidence of how Jesus of Nazareth fulfills this specific prophecy, that he is the prophet expected, the other prophet like Moses? Because we need to show that proof. Because the people of the Islamic faith, they declare adamantly that this prophet, this other prophet that would come into the world, predicted by Moses, would be Muhammad. What Christians can seize upon is what St. Luke records in his Gospel in chapter 9, verses 28 to 36. And that's the episode on Mount Tabor, the Transfiguration, when Jesus takes St. Peter and the sons of Zebedee, St. John and St. James, and they climb up that mountain. The scriptures call it a high mountain. It doesn't actually give it the name Tabor, but we call it Tabor. And Jesus is there on the top of that mountain, and suddenly he's transfigured. His face and his body, what shines forth from under his humanity is his divinity. And then you have, on one side, Moses appearing, and on the other side, the prophet Elijah appearing. And then you have the voice of the Father. This is my beloved Son. To him listen. Now that's what we need to seize upon. The voice of the Father vindicating Jesus as the expected one. The prophecy through Moses is that the Messiah, that other prophet, will be the one that we need to listen to. And it's here that Yahweh declares of Jesus of Nazareth, listen to him. Why Moses? Why Elijah? Moses, of course, stood for the law, and Elijah stood for the prophets. And Moses was testifying, being a witness to the mission of Jesus, that he wasn't a lawbreaker. And Elijah was testifying to the reality that Jesus was not a blasphemer. Elijah, means Yahweh is my God. The mission of Elijah was to fight for the true God against Baalism in particular in the northern kingdom in Israel. And he would not tolerate any form of idolatry or worship of another besides Yahweh. And it's Elijah standing here giving testimony to Jesus that he wasn't a blasphemer to claim that he was the Son of God. And hence divine as well. Now, we move on. Numbers 24:17. Now this, of course, is one of those famous prophecies that many people seize upon that relates directly to Christmas. How? This is actually a prophetic statement of a rather obscure prophet named Balaam. And he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not nigh. So what century we're looking at here? 19th century BC. He has a vision of this one who is to come. I see him, but he's not now. He's well into the future. I behold him, but not nigh. He's not near. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And most Christian apologists, and it was the intent of St. Matthew, because St. Matthew seizes on this and embeds it in his gospel, and we have it in chapter 2, verses 2, 7 to 10. St. Matthew seizes upon this verse to state that the star that will come out of Jacob is the Star of Bethlehem. And that's a legitimate interpretation. I think this is one of those verses that has a double meaning. It does refer to the Star of Bethlehem, But that star that comes out of Jacob, that scepter that comes out of Israel, is actually Jesus himself. It is the Messiah. The Messiah is the star that comes out of Jacob, as a descendant of Jacob. Jacob begets Judah and right through to David, etc., to the time of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus is also that scepter that shall rise out of Israel, because he is a king. And he is the ultimate king in the house of David. The next prophecy is in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14. Now Isaiah is a prophet in the late 8th century BC. And he gives us a number of prophecies tonight. The first is as follows. Very famous one relating to Christmas as well. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. And this is, again, St. Matthew seizes on this. We see him in chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, stating that Jesus of Nazareth is that Emmanuel, born of a virgin, namely the Virgin Mary. What's the context of this prophecy? It's late 8th century BC, and Judah, the southern kingdom, is besieged. Besieged by Israel in the north and Aram, Syria. Israel to the north and Aram have entered into a military alliance to attack Judah. And the king at the time is King Achaz. Because Judah refuses to enter into a military alliance with Israel and Aram against Assyria, further to the north. And Achaz is terrified at the prospect that Judah will be overrun and he'll be dethroned and the house of David will come to an end. And Isaiah is trying to give confidence to Achaz that the house of David will not fall. And Isaiah challenges Achaz to ask Yahweh for a sign that the house of David will never fall. Achaz feigns humility here and says, no, I'm not going to test Yahweh. I'm not going to put him to the test. So Isaiah says, nevertheless, I will give you a sign. What is that sign that the house of David will stand forever, will never fall? Well, it's the fact that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And that son will be Emmanuel, or as St. Matthew interprets, God among us. Now, Achaz couldn't see that at the time. Not at all. Now, the way we interpret this as Christians, as Catholics, are firmly in the reality that this virgin, that we use the word virgin, we use the word virgin here because we rely on the Greek translation of Isaiah in the Septuagint, where the word there, this translation is produced by Jews living in Alexandria in Egypt in the 3rd century BC. It's a contemporary Bible for those Jews in the diaspora living outside of Palestine who can't speak or read Hebrew anymore. They need a vernacular Bible, one in Greek. So the Greek word there, Parthenos, is unequivocally, that means virgin. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son. That's the sign. And that's what is miraculous. Virgins don't normally conceive and bear children, let alone sons who will be great kings. The problem arises, and it's not really a problem. I don't have a problem with the Catholic interpretation here. It's that in the Jewish text, the word is not Parthenos, it's Alma, and Alma is equivocal, means a young woman. Now, in those days, a young woman could definitely have been a virgin or not, a young woman. A young woman shall conceive and bear a son. Well, that happens every day. And so Jewish apologists say, okay, look, this prophecy, you Christians, you seize it and you claim it for Jesus of Nazareth, but in reality, you got the translation wrong. It's not virgin, it's just young woman. And the child that she has is that great King Hezekiah. Now, Hezekiah would be a great king of Judah in the late 8th century BC and the first years of the 7th century BC. So they say, well, this son is Hezekiah. But the Christians have always seen this, and St. Matthew first recognized it or put it in writing for us, that it is a virgin and that child of hers would be God among us. Now, the next prophecy, again from Isaiah, Isaiah 11:1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of David, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Now, both St. Matthew in chapter 1, St. Luke in chapter 3, and St. Luke again in chapter 4, seize upon this prophecy. Matthew and Luke in their genealogies attempt to show how Jesus of Nazareth is a descendant of Jesse. And in chapter 4, verse 18 in St. Luke's Gospel, St. Luke records the very words of Jesus preaching in the synagogue in Nazareth, that he is the fulfillment of the second part of this prophecy. So let's look at this prophecy again in two specific parts. The first, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of David, of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. Isaiah in the late 8th century BC foresees the house of David as a dead tree. It's lifeless. The house of David appears to be petrified, dead. By the time Jesus is born, the house of David hasn't been ruling in Israel since the early years of the 6th century BC. Because then the Babylonians conquered, the Persians conquered the Babylonians, the Greeks under Alexander the Great conquered the Persians. And then even when the Jews in the time of the Maccabees regained independence, it was not the house of David that was in power. The Hasmoneans, following from the Maccabees, were not of the house of David. By the time Jesus is born, who's in power in the world? Well, Augustus Caesar. He's been in power since 27 BC. And in Judea is the Edomite puppet of the Romans, Herod the Great. The house of David is dispossessed. It's not visibly in power. Yet it still existed. And existed here in this humble couple. St. Joseph and Our Lady were both of the house of David. But they were virtually impoverished. We know that they were poor because when they went to the temple to present the baby Jesus at the age of 40 days, they brought as their sacrifice under Leviticus 12 just 2 turtle doves, which we sing about at Christmas as well. The turtle dove was the alternative if you couldn't afford the spotless lamb. St. Joseph and Our Lady bring Jesus to present him in the temple. They're not carrying a spotless lamb, just a turtle dove, 2 turtle doves. If they were even poorer than what they were, they would have been just offering a grain offering. Now, we know from the Gospel of Matthew that St. Joseph, we call him a carpenter, but the word in Greek, he was a tekton. We get the word now in English, technology, the knowledge of how to make things. Tekton was broader than just being a carpenter. They worked with metal, they worked with rocks or stone, they worked with wood. They would have made things, they would have repaired things. That was the job of St. Joseph. Very low status, of upper, lower class status in Nazareth and Judea at the time. But Mary's yes at the Annunciation to the angel Gabriel, her free, total, full, complete and loving yes to God's call, enabled the Messiah to come into the world, and that Messiah would be known as a Nazarene. The word here, branch, Nazareth means branch. And a branch shall grow out of his roots. Suddenly life appears. That new life from this dead trunk is Jesus of Nazareth. He is the branch, that new life that comes into the world because of Mary's yes. And then the rest of this prophecy, the second half of it, Jesus claims that he has the Spirit of the Lord, the wisdom, understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, etc. And we'll come back to that again because there's another prophecy of Isaiah that talks about the anointed with these particular gifts. Next prophecy is Micah, chapter 5, verse 2. And Micah is, again, he's a contemporary of the prophet Isaiah, so we're dealing with the late 8th century BC again. And he gives us the place where the Messiah should be born. But you, O Bethlehem of Ephratah, you are little among the clans of Judah. But from thee shall come forth for me one who is to be the ruler in Israel, whose origin is from old, from ancient days. Matthew again. See, Matthew, his endeavour here, just to go back a bit, he's writing a gospel for which audience? Jews. Jews who are still not believing in Jesus, Jews who might be on the edge, who needed some convincing, or to fortify the faith of those Jews who were already Christian, who'd believed in Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. So Matthew has embedded in his gospel about 60 Old Testament prophecies to show that this Jesus of Nazareth did tick all these boxes. He did fulfill the expectations, the ancient expectations. And he goes out of his way, therefore, to show how Jesus, because of the decree of the Emperor Augustus, St. Joseph and Our Lady leave Nazareth and head down to Bethlehem because of the registration decree of Augustus Caesar, which occurred around the year 3 to 2 BC. The purpose of that registration was for everyone in the empire to acknowledge Augustus as the leading person of the empire, that is basically emperor, and to give allegiance to him as emperor. Now, interesting here where it says, whose origin is from of old. So this figure, this messianic figure, who is to be born in Bethlehem, his origin is from old, from ancient days. That term ancient days is another name for God. That's the name for God in Daniel chapter 7. When this Son of Man figure leaves the world and goes to the right-hand side of God, who appears as an ancient of days, old man, big white beard, etc., and is crowned as king in the kingdom of the Ancient of Days. So we see here an oblique reference to the fact that this messianic figure would be an eternal figure, not a created figure, created in time, but comes from of old, from ancient days, coming from heaven into this world. Then we go to Hosea. Hosea is also an 8th century prophet, but he's a prophet to the northern kingdom, Israel. And we have chapter 11, verse 1. In the storm, the king of Israel shall be utterly cut off. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew takes this and engages in an analogous spiritual meaning. When you read this prophecy in its original context, the impression is that Yahweh is reminding his people that you were once my... The relationship between Yahweh and Israel in the Old Testament is meant to be a spousal relationship. God, the bridegroom, Israel is meant to be the faithful bride. But unfortunately, Israel too often enough, commits harlotry, prostitution, and spiritual prostitution by worshipping other gods. Now, before Israel becomes the faithful spouse of God, of Yahweh, it was the child of Yahweh, because Yahweh created Israel, brought forth Israel. And when you were but a child, being formed, I called you out of Egypt. And that was the historical fact of the Exodus under Moses. But Matthew also, in addition to that historical, literal event, he adds a secondary spiritual meaning to this verse. It also applies to Jesus of Nazareth, who was called out of Egypt. Because if you can remember, and it's only Matthew who records this episode, where the Holy Family, to escape the wrath of Herod the Great, flee from Bethlehem because of the injunction of the angel Gabriel and make their way into Egypt. We don't know precisely how much time they spend in Egypt, but it was enough time for Herod the Great to die and his son Archelaus to come and rule in Judea. So it could have been at least a couple of years. So the Messiah, Jesus, is called out of Egypt to come back to Judah. Then we got the prophet Jeremiah, 7th century BC. And in Jeremiah 31:15, thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are not. None are left. Matthew again, chapter 2, verses 16 to 18 says, this is fulfilled in the massacre of the innocents. When Herod the Great realizes that he's been betrayed by the wise men, they've not come back to him to report exactly where the Messiah or this new king has been born. He remembers that they told him that according to Micah, this new king would be born in Bethlehem. So he sends his soldiers, raids Bethlehem, and commits the massacre of the innocents. Scholars looking at this episode, some doubt this episode ever happened, but that's the problem with critical biblical scholarship. But the scholars who do believe it happened say that we're talking about, for the size of Bethlehem at its time, we're talking about maybe 6 to 20 children who were massacred, who would have been around the age of 2 years of age, plus or minus at this time in Bethlehem and the surrounds. So again, Matthew, aware of this episode, embeds it in his gospel to show that this attempt to destroy Jesus when he was still a baby, a child, fulfilled this particular prophecy in Jeremiah. Then we come back to Isaiah, chapter 40, verses 3 to 5. And this is what scholars call second Isaiah. Now, I'm telling you this because you're going to encounter it. We look at Isaiah as one book, a record of the prophecies of Isaiah put together by his followers, etc., recording everything he said. Scholars go into the business of dissecting Isaiah. We have one Isaiah, then we move to 2. Now, then we move to 3. And there are some who claim that there are 4 Isaiahs. Now, there was one Isaiah. What they're saying when they say there's a 2nd, 3rd and 4th Isaiah, they're meaning that this book we call Isaiah was really constructed by no less than 2, maybe 3, maybe 4. A book I recently read said that 2nd Isaiah was a great prophet of Israel. He was so great we don't even know his name. I mean, all the prophets of Israel, great or minor, major or minor, we know their names, but we don't even know the name of this great 2nd Isaiah. I'm mentioning this because chapter 40, this prophecy in chapter 40 is said to be in 2nd Isaiah, recorded by 2nd Isaiah. It's not a prophecy recorded by Isaiah, the original Isaiah or his followers. But that's an academic argument on the side. If you go to Israel and you go to where the Dead Sea Scrolls are stored and you go to see the scroll of Isaiah, it's quite obvious that the Essene community regarded Isaiah as the work of one prophet and his followers. Now, Isaiah 43 to 5, that's chapter 40, verses 3 to 5, a voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." 3 of the gospel writers seize upon this prophecy and say it was fulfilled by Jesus of Nazareth. In Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 to 3, Luke chapter 3, verses 3 to 6, and Mark chapter 1. In fact, basically, Mark opens his gospel with the adult John the Baptist preaching in the wilderness. This voice in the wilderness is John the Baptist, preparing for the coming of the Messiah. The language here is that this messianic figure will be the glory of the Lord. That's very, very significant. The term glory doesn't mean what we think it means in our own language. Oh, we won the grand final. Oh, that's glorious. All right. Glory actually means the presence of God among us. Kabod, glory. Shekinah kabod mean the glory presence. At this time in Jewish history, at the beginning of what we call the 1st century AD, the Shekinah kabod was not housed, was not residing among his people, as he did for centuries from the days of the tabernacle, 15th century BC, right to the 6th century BC. The days of the tabernacle and the first temple. This is when God dwelt among his people as a cloud by day or a fire by night, enthroned above the Ark of the Covenant, housed in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, and then later on in the temple. When the Babylonians destroyed the temple in 586 BC, this glory presence departed from Israel. The prophet Ezekiel saw the Shekinah depart. Ezekiel was now in exile in Babylon and had been in exile in Babylon since 597 BC. And he had this vision of the Shekinah departing from the temple and going to a mountain in the east. We believe that is Mount Olivet, and ascending back into heaven from this mountain. When the second temple stood there in Israel, there was no Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, nor was there a Shekinah presence enthroned above it. The Shekinah, the glory presence, would return. The Messiah would be that Shekinah among the people of God. Not as fire, not as cloud, but now in human flesh, because it says here, all flesh shall see it. When the glory comes, and that this precursor would prepare the way for the glory, John the Baptist will prepare the way for Jesus. When this Messiah comes, all flesh will see it, meaning he'll be in human form. Because in the days of the tabernacle and the temple, this Shekinah was housed behind that great curtain. Only the high priest, once a year on the Day of Atonement, would go into that room, pronounce the name of Yahweh, do the requisite sacrifices, and only he could see Yahweh as cloud or fire. When the new glory comes, everyone will be able to see him because he'll be in human flesh. Then we go to Isaiah 9 verses 1 to 2. But there will be no gloom for her that was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined. And Matthew chapter 4 verses 13 to 16 says that this is fulfilled by Jesus of Nazareth, because he came from Galilee and he began his public mission in Galilee, and he's preaching and teaching and miracle workings in Galilee. He was that light to that people in northern Israel, a people who'd lived in darkness for so long, because northern Israel, more than Judah, suffered from reversion or idolatry, worshipping of Baal, etc. And they'd gone through a terrible time with the Assyrian exile, etc. And now this Messiah, unexpectedly for most Jews, would come from Galilee and be the light of the Jews, coming first from Galilee. Psalm 78 verses 1 to 2. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I'll open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from of old. And it's Jesus himself who says that he fulfills this prophecy. And that is recorded by St. Matthew in his Gospel, chapter 13, verses 34 to 35. Then we have Isaiah 61, verses 1 to 2. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. And once again, this is Jesus preaching in the synagogue in Nazareth, recorded by Luke in chapter 4, verses 16 to 21, who states publicly that he is a fulfillment of this prophecy. The year of the Lord, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour, meant to proclaim a jubilee. In ancient Israel, they had a jubilee, a great jubilee, every 50 years. On that 50th year, all debts were to be released. People were to be released of all debts, and all debt slaves were to be released. And the great jubilee, the perpetual jubilee that would be every day, every year, would come with the Messiah. who pays off the debt for us on the cross and who frees us from the slavery of sin. Then we have Psalm 69:9. For zeal for thy house has consumed me, and the insults of those who insult thee have fallen on me. Now John in chapter 2 records when Jesus, he placed it at a different time. At the beginning, when Jesus first comes to Jerusalem, that Jesus cleanses the temple, drives out the money changers, etc. And the justification for doing that, Jesus seizes upon this prophecy. For zeal for thy house has consumed me. This house, this temple is Jesus' house. Because it's the house of his Father. The temple was the house of God, the house of his Father. And the Son inherits the house of the Father. And furthermore, this is the glory of the second temple, coming to claim the temple as his own. Now, he'd already been there. We know that Jesus was presented in the temple at 40 days of age. That's when the glory first came to the second temple. And Jesus at the age of 13 is found, or 12, is found in the temple after 3 days by St. Joseph and Our Lady, preaching there, teaching and answering questions to all the scribes and Pharisees who were amazed at his intelligence, etc. So this is the third time we know in Scripture, but there would have been other times. But the third time we know in Scripture when the glory has come to his house, to the temple, and cleansed it because it's his. Then we go to Zechariah 9:9. And Zechariah is a prophet of the late 6th century BC. He says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on an ass, on a colt, the foal of an ass." Now, John chapter 12 records this event. We know this event to be Palm Sunday. One view of the Messiah, a majority view of the Messiah that most Jews held, is that the Messiah, when he comes, will be a military kingly figure. In the line of David, a king, and a military figure like Judas Maccabeus, who'd come and redeem Israel, meaning to take Israel back from the Romans, to cleanse Israel of all Greco-Roman pagan influence. He'll come on a white horse with legions behind him, armies behind him, maybe angels also to support him to achieve this great victory. And after achieving this victory, will be enthroned on Mount Zion and undisturbed until the end of the world. And from there, the Messiah and Israel will be the light to the Gentiles, as Isaiah says. And the whole world will come to know the true God through this triumphant messianic figure. Now, that was the view most Jews had of the expected Messiah. But Jesus, when he did come, he didn't come on a white horse. He came on a donkey. And that fulfilled this prophecy, Zechariah 9:9, as St. John records. Then we have Psalm 118, verses 22 to 23. This is Jesus himself, as recorded in Matthew chapter 21, verse 42. Jesus himself says that he fulfills this prophecy when he's confronting and rebuking the Pharisees, or challenging the Pharisees. And again, St. Peter, when he's before the Sanhedrin, is recorded in Acts chapter 4. Jesus fulfills this particular prophecy. The stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. Jesus is the chief stone. The builders were the leaders of the Jewish nation. They rejected Jesus. They rejected that chief stone. But nevertheless, that stone would become the cornerstone of a new great temple, the people of God, the church, one holy, Catholic and apostolic. Then we have Psalm 2, verses 1 to 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed. And this is written of by St. Luke in Acts chapter 4, verses 24 to 28. This is the Christians seized on this and said it related to their very moment when they were being persecuted. St. Peter was arrested, imprisoned. This is at the time of Herod Agrippa I. St. James, the apostle, St. James the Greater, the older, had been arrested and executed. He was the first apostle to be a martyr. That pleased the Jews according to St. Luke, and Herod Agrippa went further and arrested St. Peter, and St. Peter was ultimately being lined up for execution himself. This is a persecution of the church in these very nascent early years of Christianity, and the Christians then believed it was a fulfillment of Psalm 2. The kings and rulers are conspiring against the Lord and his anointed. Psalm 41:9. Even my bosom friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. And it's Jesus himself who quotes this scripture at the time of the Last Supper, relating to Judas and his betrayal of Jesus. John 13 verse 18 records that. Then Zechariah 13:7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, says the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, that the sheep may be scattered. And again, it's Jesus who quotes this verse, relating to how he is the shepherd. Strike him, and the sheep will be scattered. Strike Jesus, and the apostles fled, the disciples fled. And again, that's Matthew chapter 26, verse 31, quotes Jesus here. Then we have Zechariah 11, verses 12 to 13. Then I said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 shekels of silver. Then the Lord said to me, cast it into the treasury, the lordly price at which I was paid off by them. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and cast them into the treasury in the house of the Lord. Matthew chapter 27 verses 6 to 10 records how Judas receives 30 pieces of silver when he betrayed Jesus, and then feeling guilty afterwards came back and returned it to the Jewish leaders, but they wouldn't accept it because they said it's blood money, and so they put it into the treasury from which they bought a field. Isaiah 53, 3 to 5. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he was borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed. And this is, of course, a prophecy relating to the passion of Christ. St. Peter, in his first epistle, chapter 2, verse 24, uses the term when writing to his audience that it is through Jesus, it's through his wounds that we are healed. Obviously giving credence to what happened to Jesus in his passion as the fulfillment of this prophecy. Isaiah 53, 7 to 8, the following verses, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people. It's in Acts 8 verses 26 to 40 that St. Luke gives us the episode relating to the Ethiopian eunuch who's reading this verse and doesn't know who it refers to. And Philip, he actually gives himself, he takes time to give this Ethiopian eunuch an understanding that this was fulfilled by Jesus of Nazareth through his passion, through his death. And of course, we know specifically when we read the Gospels that Jesus, when he came before his judges, whether they be in the Sanhedrin or whether they be Pontius Pilate, for the most part he was silent, like that lamb to the slaughter. Psalm 21, 16 to 18, yea, dogs are round about me, a company of evildoers encircle me. They have pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my raiment they cast lots. Matthew chapter 27, John chapter 19, in those chapters we have the crucifixion. And they outline specifically how Jesus in his crucifixion fulfilled this. The dogs were around me. We see at the foot of the cross the enemies of Jesus, the scribes and the Pharisees there, watching and waiting, hoping that Jesus would die as soon as possible. They have pierced my hands and feet. When this psalm was first composed, they could not probably have imagined crucifixion because it was introduced into that part of the world by the Romans. I can count all my bones, meaning that you look at this figure on the cross with his hands and feet pierced, you could count his ribs as Jesus struggled on the cross, mostly naked, trying to breathe, desperately trying to keep breathing, forcing himself up to take breath. They stare and gloat over me. We see in the Gospels, Mark, etc., how the enemies of Jesus, while they waited for his death, mocked him and ridiculed him. And of course we know that his garments were divided and cast for lots. And they cast lots for it. Isaiah 53:12. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. Fulfilled as recorded in Mark 15 in two ways. He is numbered with the transgressors, meaning that he would be punished, he'll be put to death, he'll be crucified between two others. The good and the bad thief. By tradition we call them Dismas and Gizmas. And he made intercession for them. Jesus is on the cross saying, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do. And then to the good thief who repents, Jesus says, today you shall be with me in paradise. Then we go to Psalm 69:21. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. John chapter 19 records, verses 28 to 30, when Jesus is on the cross and they offer him the vinegar to drink from the sponge on the spear. This is when Jesus says, I thirst. And when he drinks the vinegar on the sponge, he says it is finished. And that's how the Passover normally concluded. With the fourth cup, when they drank it, the presider at the Passover meal said it is finished. That vinegar on that sponge that Jesus drank was the fourth cup that Jesus didn't drink with his disciples in the upper room in the Passover, just previous. He drinks that fourth cup on the cross and he transforms, as the Messiah, he brings to the world a new Passover meal. And that new Passover, he transformed the Passover meal in the upper room into a new event that didn't just commemorate a previous escape from Egypt, but actually affected a new escape from sin. From that new Passover, we also got a new manna, the Eucharist, for a new Exodus, a new escape to a new promised land, namely the heavenly Jerusalem, the escape from sin rather than the escape from Egypt. Zechariah 12:10, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of compassion and supplication, so that when they look on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. And again, this is fulfilled, recorded in John 19, verses 32 to 37. John is the only disciple at the foot of the cross besides the holy women, Our Lady and the holy women. He sees and records the fact that Jesus is already dead on the cross, his hands and feet pierced, but the executioners, to ensure that he is dead, go up to him, rather than breaking the bones of his legs to cause him to suffocate and die quickly from asphyxiation. They see that he's already dead, but not to take any chances, they pierce him through the right side. Zechariah 13:1. On that day there shall be a fountain open for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from their sin and uncleanness. That house of David is embodied in Jesus. That fountain that's opened in the house of Jesus is what I just said, when Jesus is pierced in his right side. On that day is Good Friday. When Jesus' side is pierced, what comes forth? What does St. John record? What does he see? That blood and water came forth. The blood symbolizes the Eucharist, the water, baptism. The water flowing from the side of Jesus is that new flood, is that water that will cleanse the world from sin and uncleanness. And when we read about the early church and baptism, we go to Acts 2, verse 38 tells us that baptism was to be administered because in the name of Jesus, for the forgiveness of sins and the bestowal of the Holy Spirit. And we go to another prophecy, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27. Of course, Ezekiel, remember, is late 7th century, early 6th century BC. He says the following: I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness. And from all your idols I will cleanse you. A new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will take out your flesh, the heart of stone, and give you a heart of flesh. And I'll put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances. That is a prophecy relating to baptism. I will sprinkle clean water upon you, and when you are thus sprinkled, you will have a new heart, you'll be cleaned of your uncleanliness, and the Spirit of God will be bestowed upon you. And again, that's reflected in Acts 2 verse 38, what baptism does for the Christian. And we go to Jonah 1:17. Now Jonah is a prophet to Israel, prophet to Israel in the 8th century BC. And he says, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And it's the very words of Jesus recorded in Matthew chapter 16 verse 4. Jesus himself says, the only sign you will be given to the unbelievers is the sign of the prophet Jonah. What's that sign? Well, Jonah was called on a mission to Assyria, Gentiles, the enemy, the hated enemy. Reluctant to carry out that mission at first, attempts to flee to the other side of the known world, gets on a boat to go to Tarshish. Where's Tarshish? It's in Spain. It was a Phoenician colony at the time. Thinking that if he goes that far away, he'll get out of the jurisdiction, the range, the power of Yahweh, because Yahweh is the God of Israel only, really, when you think about it. If I go to Tarshish, he couldn't bother me over there. But of course, we know the story. Yahweh causes a storm to happen. They throw Jonah out because they recognize that he's the cause of the storm. This great fish, as it's called, entombs Jonah in its belly, and 3 days later he's spat out on the beach. And then he goes forth and fulfills his mission. He preaches successfully to his great surprise, and the Ninevites are converted. But Jesus is saying this Jonah in this event is a prefigurement of me. Jesus of Nazareth is also a prophet and more, and he has a mission to the Gentiles as well as the Jews, and he'll be entombed likewise for 3 days, and he, like Jonah, will emerge out of that tomb alive. Psalm 16, 8-10, I keep the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body also dwells secure. For thou dost not give me up to Sheol, or let thy godly one see the pit. And it's St. Paul preaching in Asia Minor, in Antioch in Pisidia, on his first missionary journey. St. Luke records this in Acts chapter 13, verses 32 to 37. St. Paul is preaching that it is Jesus who fulfills this, because the words, the godly one shall not see the pit, for thou dost not give me up to Sheol, or let thy godly one see that. In other words, the dead Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, will not, when he dies, will not descend to Sheol and remain there. His body will not see corruption. He will descend to Sheol. Sheol is a general Hebrew term for the underworld, but that underworld had many houses. And one of those houses was Abraham's bosom. And Abraham's bosom was where all the just of Old Testament times, from Adam and Eve onward, were waiting to go to heaven, because until the Messiah came, fulfilled his mission, ascended into heaven, opened heaven, no one could go to heaven. Jesus, when he dies on Good Friday, as we read in 1 Peter 3:19-21, he descends to those spirits that were in prison, that is in Abraham's bosom, that part of Sheol. Preaches to them the good news of his death and upcoming resurrection, and that he'll take those souls into heaven eventually. So Jesus is in Sheol, but only for a short time, because by his resurrection he emerges in his body, a now glorified body. His body does not see corruption. Daniel 9:26, and after the 62 weeks an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the prince of the people who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations are decreed. Now, we have this fulfilled in Luke 19, verses 41-44. This anointed one shall be cut off is the Messiah. Jesus of Nazareth is cut off. When he's crucified outside the city walls of Jerusalem. That is meaning rejection, excommunication. You are not one of us. You are not one of the faithful Jewish people. You are a blasphemer. You are a sinner. But then the people of the prince shall come. That is, the Romans will come. The people of the Roman emperor will come. Eventually. It's actually 40 years later. One biblical generation later, in the Jewish War of AD 66 to 70, it's now, imagine yourself in the year 70, shall come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. These Romans, these legions of this prince, namely Augustus, under the authority of Vespasian and his son Titus, they will come and they'll descend upon Jerusalem. And they'll descend upon the temple. They will destroy Jerusalem. They'll destroy the temple. The day is the 10th of August, AD 70. Over 1 million Jews are killed in this war. If you read the Jewish war by Josephus, the Romans surrounded the city, a city that was packed with pilgrims at Passover time. They would not let anyone escape. The Jews, for the most part, died of starvation. They descended into cannibalism. And again, over 1 million died in this siege. And at the end of it, before the end, Vespasian has gone back to Rome to be emperor, to restore order after the death of Nero and the chaos of short-term successive emperors. Vespasian has gone back to be emperor, and he's left his son Titus to fulfill the job, to finish off the job. Titus didn't want the temple to be destroyed. He tried desperately to stop soldiers throwing flames, torches, but they kept throwing them over his head, and those torches set the temple alight and brought it to an end. There has not been Jewish sacrifice, since August the 8th, AD 70. And there cannot be Jewish sacrifice while there is no temple. And the temple cannot be rebuilt because there's a Dome of the Rock mosque sitting on top of it, one of the most holiest sites of Islam. But this had to be eclipsed, because all this in ancient Israel, the sacrifices, particularly of the scapegoat and the lamb, the high priest, the temple, were just shadows, prefigurements of the Messiah who would come, who would be the Lamb of God, who would be the scapegoat, who would be the one eternal high priest, and would be the temple. It's that Jesus who said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. That's why it's eclipsed, never to be rebuilt. If you hear anyone, as I did last year when I'm in Israel, we had a Jewish tour guide, a very nice fellow, very knowledgeable and respectful fellow, who was a temple restorationist, and we're looking at the Temple Mount there, we're looking at the Dome of the Rock mosque on top of the mount, and he's saying one day, we don't know how, but one day God will have this mosque removed and the temple will be rebuilt. With all respect, it won't be rebuilt. Julian the Apostate, that emperor in the year AD 363, attempted to have it rebuilt. And what had happened in the course of the construction work, earthquakes, the ground opened up, flames emerged from the ground to prevent the workers progressing with their work. Is this Christian propaganda? No, not at all. The record of this doesn't come from Christians. It comes from the biographer of Julian the Apostate himself, who reported it. Ammianus. Ammianus was the biographer, and he recorded what happened at the building site at the temple. What we know as Christians is that God wasn't going to allow the temple to be rebuilt because it served its purpose. The fundamentalist Americans, many of them believe that when they read Ezekiel that the temple is going to be rebuilt. Okay, there was the first temple of Solomon destroyed 586 BC, the second temple 515 BC to AD 70. Really, that was a second and a half temple because it was built, and then Herod the Great in his day had it augmented to a colossal structure. Forecourts and retaining walls, etc. It was one of the wonders of the world at that time. It's been destroyed, and some fundamentalists look at Ezekiel today and they see this prophecy of a temple being restored, etc. And they think, well, the temple in Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt one day in our time, and there are going to be sacrifices again in the temple. Some Pentecostals believe that. There'll be animal sacrifices again in the rebuilt temple. This, with all respect, is, to put it mildly, is nonsense, because it's been fulfilled. It won't be rebuilt. It's like the caterpillar that's now the butterfly. The butterfly is Jesus. He is all those things. The caterpillar is not going to return. It's now become the butterfly. Anyway, one last prophecy. Daniel 2, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, the statue and the various parts. And this is a good one to finish on. It's the year 604 BC. The Babylonians have just defeated the Assyrian Empire and demolished it. And that was in the year 605 BC. And they defeated the Egyptians in the process, because the Egyptians came up with an army to support the Assyrians against the Babylonians. This was a world war. Babylonia, within the Assyrian Empire, had gone into revolt, and they went into alliance with some smaller states, Elam to the southeast and Media to the northwest. This alliance attacked Assyria. And over the course of over a decade, from 616 BC to 605 BC, Assyria desperately tried to hang in there. And the Egyptians came to help the Assyrians because they wanted to keep a weak Assyrian state there as a buffer between themselves and Babylon. It failed. Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, the Assyrians were eclipsed and the Babylonians ruled the known world, or the most important part of the world. And the king was Nebuchadnezzar. He just succeeded his father, Nabopolassar, and he saw himself as king of kings and of course divine as well. And one day he had this dream. And he was greatly disturbed by the dream. It's the second year of his reign, so it's a 604 BC thereabouts. And he called his soothsayers and astrologers in. These are his public servants that he pays. Interpret this dream for me. And none of them could. None of them understood it. So he had them dismissed, and dismissal in those days meant execution. They didn't get a payout, they just were executed. Anyway, the king was told that there's this Jewish fellow here among us named Daniel who can interpret dreams. So Nebuchadnezzar said, well, bring in this Daniel. I need to know what this dream means. Daniel comes in, I'm just paraphrasing here. Daniel says, O King of Kings, the dream you saw was of a great statue made of many parts. And the head of this statue was in gold. And that head of gold is you. And Nebuchadnezzar, oh, yeah, of course, I'm the head of gold, of course. Thank you. But then Daniel had the courage to go on and say, but you will one day be succeeded by another kingdom, lesser than yours, but another kingdom. And they'll be the kingdom of silver. And in this statue, the arms and the shoulders were silver. And who came after the Babylonians were the Persians. 539 BC, they destroyed the Babylonian army at a place called Opis, and then they marched into Babylon. And the Persians were now the ascendant, and that was the silver. And the Persians would rule from the time of Cyrus, 539 BC, to the time roughly 332 BC. So just over 200 years, 208 years. And the third part of the statue was in bronze. The torso, the hips. And that was the Greco-Macedonian Empire under Alexander the Great, who would come and eclipse the Persians. But they would be in turn eclipsed because the rest of the statue had 2 legs of iron. And eventually, the Romans would spread eastwards and they'll slowly demolish the remnant kingdoms that followed the Alexandrian kingdom. After Alexander the Great died, after 14 years trying to conquer the world, he died at the very young age of 33, a while in Babylon, and had these different kingdoms being formed. 2 of the most significant ones for our purposes were Seleucia and Ptolemaic Egypt. Basically in Syria and in Egypt. And they vied and struggled with each other for control over the Holy Land. Well, the Romans eventually came and destroyed the Seleucian Empire and incorporated it into their own empire. Then they incorporated Egypt, the Ptolemaic Empire, you know the story, Cleopatra, etc., Julius Caesar and all that. And they represented the legs of iron because the Roman Empire was tough and strong, as we know, very, very militaristic, very well organised, and they ruled east and west, the 2 legs, east and west. This whole statue stood on feet of clay. And in the same dream, Nebuchadnezzar saw this mountain. And coming down this mountain was a little rock, not made of human hands, specifically described as akaropata in Greek, not made of human hands. And as this little rock came down the mountain, it got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it smashed into the feet of clay and the statue collapsed. And it lay on the ground in rubble. But then over time, the wind blew it away like the sand, like the dust. It blew away. And this little rock, not made of human hands, in itself became a great mountain that covered the earth. Now, this prophecy is messianic. This prophecy relates to Christ because that little rock not made of human hands is Jesus Christ coming into the world. Small at first, the little band of followers, the 12 apostles, etc. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger over the centuries. And then eventually it converted the Roman Empire. And all these pagan empires, based on feet of clay, that is based on idolatry, false gods that don't exist, etc., was brought to rubble and blown away. And that little rock became a great mountain, covered the world. That's the church. One holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. That's the kingdom of David today. Mary's, yes, brought a restoration of the kingdom of David in her time as a little branch, the root of Jesse. And it's now grown to be that kingdom that covers the whole earth. The kingdom of David exists today. It's the new Israel. The new Israel is the church, one holy Catholic and Apostolic. Jesus is the ultimate king in that new Israel. The Pope is his prime minister. The apostles and their successors, the bishops of the world, are his cabinet, and they rule hopefully a lot better than our current governments do for the benefit of the people. And on that note, we'll finish. That's the last prophecy for tonight. Thank you. God bless, and have a blessed Christmas and a glorious New Year. Thank you.